Hello, Miami alumni and friends. JJ Slager here from the Alumni Association, eager to bring you another webinar featuring one of our outstanding professors at Miami. Dr. Allison Farrell is here with us today. Allison, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
We are so glad to have you. Allison is a professor in the Department of Psychology. And just for a little brief background about Allison, she is a PhD from University of Minnesota and went to Wayne State University before joining Miami in 2019. And her research focuses on the interplay between close relationships, stress, and physical health, which is why you're all here as we're presenting healthy relationships, healthy body. We did get some questions ahead of time, so we'll get to those later with Allison. Thank you for those. And then as a reminder, as always, you can ask questions live throughout the presentation by clicking the Ask a Question button below your video. We'll keep an eye on those for the end of the presentation. So without further ado, Allison, I will turn it over to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here and get to talk to Miami alumni about the work that I've been doing and that I'm planning to do in the future, looking at links between close relationships and physical health. So when we think about what predicts our health, what determines whether we're healthy or not, or at risk for experiencing different kinds of health problems, the things people usually think about might be things like genetic risk factors, health behaviors like smoking or exercise, and adherence to treatment and medical professionals' recommendations. But more recently, there's been a push to start looking at other kinds of risk factors, particularly what the CDC and the National Institute of Health have termed social determinants of health. So thinking about factors surrounding individuals in their social context, their educational experiences, their neighborhoods, and the physical environments they live in. And most relevant for me and my work, thinking about the social and community context that they live in. And based off of the body of work that's been done thinking about these social and community contexts, there's been an increased interest in looking at social connection and relationships as a public health priority. And so people often kind of have a reaction to this where they seem to think, is this really that big a deal? Is social, connection really that, much of a risk factor for public health? But we can see some really major effects of close relationships and relationships broadly on major health outcomes. So for example, if we look at people's level of disconnectedness or isolation, whether that's measured subjectively based on how much they perceive they're isolated or based on their number of social interactions each day, we see that as people become more isolated, they rate their overall physical health as lower. Furthermore, if we look at more objective markers like mortality, we see that for older individuals, those who are more isolated, so looking at those solid black lines for both men and women, over time, they are more likely to die. If we look at those mortality rates of older adults, they are more likely to die in the months following interviews where we learn about their level of social integration. So it seems that isolation seems to be impacting, really major markers of health like being alive or not. And we see these kinds of effects if we look at close relationships specifically. So if we look at marital status, for example, we see that individuals who are married or living with a partner rather than those who are divorced or separated or widowed are more likely to report their health as being excellent or very good. And once again, looking at older adults, longitudinal studies looking at mortality rates find that those who are never married, widowed, or divorced are at higher risk of dying in their 70s, 80s, 90s, and early hundreds than individuals who are married. We see that kind of 1 odds ratio as being the rate for married individuals, and we see higher risk of mortality for all other individuals across those groups. And so just to kind of put these effects in context and think about how big are these effects compared to those kinds of traditional health risk factors. Meta-analyses show this kind of range of effect sizes. So we see smoking has sort of a moderate effect size on mortality. Other risk factors like alcohol consumption, physical activity, BMI, body mass index, predict mortality rates to varying extents. But when we put relationships into the mix, we see that relationships have just as big an effect size on early mortality as these other risk factors, if not more. And particularly when we look at the quality of those relationships, not just, how often are you interacting with other people, what your, marital status is, but to what extent are your relationships providing you with high versus low levels of social support? That can have a really big impact. So in today's talk, I'm going to focus on work that I've been doing, thinking about what are the mechanisms linking relationships and health. Why do we see these links between relationship status and quality and health outcomes? So thinking both about biological mechanisms and psychological mechanisms that underlie these links. And then in the second half of my talk, I'll be talking more about some takeaways that you can take into your lives and your relationships. Trying to understand how we can improve our relationships to improve our health. So I'll talk about 5 things that are great to do for improving health and relationship quality, and 5 things that are not so good that should be avoided. All right, so in order to understand some of the studies I'll be talking about today and understand these sort of biological pathways that might be linking relationships and health, I need to start out with a little bit of biology. So I'll be talking about what happens when the body is under stress. So when we experience a stressor, when we face something that we feel like overwhelms the resources that we have psychologically, personally to deal with it, it sets off the signaling pathway from the brain down to our adrenal cortex. This is called the HPA axis, and it results in the release of cortisol, one of the body's key stress hormones. Cortisol circulates around the body. It binds with cortisol receptors that are in basically all tissues in the body and sets off a chain of reactions to help us deal with that stressor. So this includes things like releasing glucose or give us energy to help work through the problem, improving memory so we can kind of remember what we did before to deal with this and help us remember things for the future, and shutting down less essential processes like growth and development and certain aspects of immune functioning. This is really great in the short term. When you have a sudden, unexpected stressor, it gives you, what you need to push through that moment and help you deal with it in that time. The issue is what happens when your body has to do this over and over again, when you have repeated stressors or chronic stressors that keep arising. We see that when this occurs, your body isn't capable of putting forth such a strong reaction to each and every one. So individuals who experience a lot of chronic stress develop what we call glucocorticoid resistance. Essentially, their body isn't picking up on cortisol signals as clearly to affect these different biological processes. We see this reflected in a few different ways. One, the diurnal release of cortisol becomes dysfunctional. Cortisol increases when we experience a stressor, but it also has a typical pattern throughout the day. So individuals typically start out kind of high in cortisol first thing in the morning and have a little increase within the first 30 minutes. I like to think of this as evidence that waking up in the morning is really stressful. And then cortisol levels steadily decline throughout the day, as you see in the green line here. However, individuals who experience a lot of chronic stress show a flatter pattern with less of an increase in the morning and less of a decline throughout the day. We also see that individuals who experience a lot of chronic stress and develop glucocorticoid resistance end up overexpressing genes related to inflammation. So inflammation is part of the body's immune system. It's more of the innate immune system that's used to fight off bacterial infections and those kinds of things. And so we want our body to have, some good resources for doing that. But the problem is that without cortisol regulating the release of those inflammatory proteins, they can get really high. And individuals can develop higher levels of chronic inflammation. This is an issue because inflammation is linked with many of the major causes of death. So here's a graph of the top causes of death in the United States. We see that many of them are inflammatory diseases. They are due to inflammation in those tissues, including heart disease, the #1 cause of death in the United States. Furthermore, inflammation has been linked to the prognosis and mortality rates of many of these other disorders. So even if they're not directly caused by inflammation, people who have high levels of inflammation are at risk for worse outcomes or for developing some of these issues. So we can really argue that inflammation is the #1 killer in America. And so anything we can do to reduce those levels of chronic inflammation is going to really improve our health in so many ways. And so when we look at close relationship functioning to see how it's linked with these kind of biological pathways that link to these health problems, what we see is that relationship functioning has been shown to affect each of these steps in the biological stress pathway, from the release of cortisol to glucocorticoid resistance, higher levels of inflammation, and higher levels of these poor health outcomes. And the general patterns we see, unsurprisingly, are that positive relationship perceptions and processes promote better health, and negative relationship perceptions and processes hurt health. So it seems that, trying to intervene in this process might be really helpful in order to improve people's health overall. But to do that, we really need to understand why this is occurring. And when we think about how relationships are affecting these biological processes, it's not that interacting with your relationship partner is leading to some kind of biological exchange that is explaining these outcomes. The mechanisms really seem to be more psychological. It's how we're feeling when we interact with our partner and how we internalize those interactions that can lead us to develop a sense of chronic stress and put us at risk for these health issues. So thinking about what some of these psychological mechanisms might be, one of the first major categories that myself and others have found great evidence for is what we've termed affective processes, or essentially basically emotion. So relationships shape the extent to which people experience positive or negative emotions and express those. They shape how people regulate their emotions, what strategies they're using, and how effectively they're able to use those strategies to turn up positive emotion and turn down negativity. It affects how reactive people are emotionally to stressors. I'll talk much more about this in a minute. And even affects the extent to which people develop mood disorders. With all these different kinds of emotional markers, we see that relationship functioning predicts those affective processes, and those affective processes predict physical health outcomes. So one study that I was a part of that illustrates this pathway really nicely focused on responsiveness, affect, and mortality. So this study used data from the Midlife in the United States study, which is a large sample of middle-aged adults from around the United States. So we have over 1,000 people who are part of this study. At the first 2 waves of this longitudinal study that were 10 years apart, people reported on their perceived partner responsiveness. So reflecting on their romantic partner, they reported how much they felt that person understood them, how much they validated their thoughts and feelings, and how much that person showed caring and affection towards them. At wave 2, people also completed what we call daily diaries, basically nightly surveys asking them to reflect on the day they just experienced. In these daily diaries, they were asked about daily stressors. Did you experience something stressful today? Did you get into an argument? Did you have a problem at work? And so we can look at days when people reported experiencing a stressor and see how their emotion fluctuates to look at daily affective reactivity to stress. Some people show pretty big emotional fluctuations when they experience stress. They have a big increase in negative emotions like anger or frustration or anxiety, and strong decreases in positive emotions like happiness and joy and excitement. While other people tend to be more even-keeled and don't have so much of an effect of stress on their emotions. And then finally, at wave 3, we looked at mortality rates to see if people were still alive or not. What we found is that if we looked at the extent to which people changed and perceived partner responsiveness from wave 1 to wave 2, so over 10 years, that predicted their daily negative affect reactivity. So individuals who managed to increase their level of responsiveness in their relationship or keep it pretty stable were less reactive to stress emotionally 10 years later. In turn, that daily negative affect reactivity predicted mortality. So individuals who were less reactive were able to prolong their lives and were more likely to be alive at wave 3. And so basically, we see evidence for this pathway that maintaining or increasing relationship quality is associated with less negative emotionality in response to stress and lower risk of death 10 years later. And so that study looked at, changes over time, but over a period of adulthood. But it seems like the relational seeds of health might be planted even earlier. A lot of research has looked at whether early experiences with relationship partners, with parents and friends and siblings and grandparents can stay with people decades later to not only predict the functioning of their relationships that they form later in life, as well as their health and well-being. So some of the work on this that I've been involved with has used the Minnesota longitudinal study of risk and adaptation. So this is a fascinating study that recruited first-time mothers who were living in poverty in the mid-1970s. And they've been following the children that were born in the 70s through age 39 and ongoing. We just found out that we've received funding for a new assessment when the participants are going to be 47, I believe. And we have so much information about these people. We have observations of them and their parents interacting during childhood. We have reports from their teachers and friends throughout childhood and adolescence. We have videos of them interacting with their romantic partners and their own children in adulthood. And more recently, we've started getting health markers from them as well. So we can look at how those early experiences predict their health in adulthood. So in one study that used this data set to look at this, we wanted to look at the effects of life stress on health. One of the nice things about this study is we have a lot of information about the life stress people experienced. So in early childhood, their mothers completed interviews about stressors going on in the household. As the participants became adolescents, they started reporting on their own life stress. But we have information about life stress at 16 time points from early childhood to age 32. We also have observations of maternal parenting across childhood and early adolescence. So having moms and kids come into the lab or researchers go to the home to watch the mothers and children engaging in age-appropriate tasks. So things like feeding and play in early infancy, problem-solving tasks during toddlerhood, and then more complicated decision-making tasks in later childhood and adolescence. So we can look at to what extent the mothers provided responsive, sensitive care to their children in these interactions. Then at age 32, we had a series of health measures. So we had people report their overall level of physical health. They reported on how many illnesses or symptoms they had started experiencing, and we got their BMI. What we found was that adult health was most associated with stress in three key life stages: early childhood, adolescence, and adulthood concurrent with health assessments. It seemed like these time periods really had a lasting effect on people's stress systems that would put them at risk for experiencing these health outcomes. And we didn't see any predictive significance added when middle childhood or young adulthood stress was included in the model. So it seems that these effects may not be so cumulative. It may be that there's sort of sensitive periods at these three stages of life that have bigger health effects. And particularly, we found what we call a dual risk pattern, when people had high stress at two critical life stages, such as adolescence and adulthood, they were at particularly high risk for developing health problems. So, for example, higher numbers of illnesses and symptoms, and lower ratings of their overall physical health. And since then, using other measures later on, we see that kind of dual risk pattern emerging again. So when we look at diurnal cortisol, we look at that kind of decline of cortisol levels across the day that should be pretty steep. We see that individuals who experienced high life stress at two life stages have the flattest cortisol slopes, which puts them at risk for particularly immune system related issues and even cancer. However, to bring that relational piece back into this, we saw that receiving high quality maternal care can completely buffer the effects of stress on health. So in one example of this, we can look at the interaction between experiencing stress in childhood and adolescence on a health outcome like BMI. We see that individuals who experience low stress at both life stages and high levels of maternal sensitivity, who had everything going for them, unsurprisingly had pretty normal levels of BMI. And individuals who had high life stress at both life stages and low maternal sensitivity tended to have the highest levels of BMI, really getting into some of those dangerously obese levels. However, individuals who experienced high life stress at both life stages, but also had highly sensitive mothers who were able to provide that high quality care, had much lower BMI, really equivalent to those individuals who experienced low life stress. So it seemed that having that high quality relationships with their mothers helped protect these individuals from the stressors they're experiencing in terms of moderating their stress systems, and resulted in better health in adulthood. So when we see these kinds of effects, we want to understand why. Once again, what are these kinds of pathways and mechanisms explaining how early experiences with parents stay with people decades later to affect their health? And when we kind of started this work, there was a lot of speculation about why this would be. And so researchers were kind of suggesting that this is because nurturant caregivers lead children to feel that others can be trusted. It leads them to read less threat into their social worlds and learn positive and effective emotion regulation strategies so that they experience less stress and can deal with stress more effectively when it comes about. And so what these kinds of characteristics really point towards is the idea of attachment orientations as a mechanism. So attachment security is the internalized belief that one can rely on relationship partners for care and support. So believing that we can count on others to be there when things go wrong. If you think about little kids, when they get scared, when they get nervous, they're going to turn to their parents. They're going to go to them as that safe haven from the scary thing that's happening. And those relationships help us feel confident going out and engaging in the world. So again, if you think about little kids when they go on the playground or they're going into a new experience, they often, want to look back over their shoulder and see that their parents there. They're excited to go out and do this, but knowing that they have that attachment figure nearby, just in case something goes wrong, helps them explore their world more confidently. These kinds of attachment orientations are based on relationships in infancy. We see this developing with your relationship with your parents and seeing if your parent can provide that kind of support for you. But what we learn about relationships in infancy stays with us from the cradle to the grave. We see that it has a lasting effect on how we develop social skills that allow us to build high quality friendships, romantic relationships, and parent our own children throughout the lifespan. And so we see that individuals with insecure attachment who don't have those positive beliefs that they can rely on relationship partners tend to find social relationships more stressful. They have more conflict in their relationships and they feel like they're more at risk for ending. They tend to have worse emotion regulation and coping skills. They may rely on things like suppression and just holding emotions in to help them cope, which turns out isn't very effective. Or they may tend to ruminate about their problems and not be able to shake things off very effectively. And they have trouble seeking support for dealing with stressors. So even when their own internal emotion regulation is overwhelmed, they can't turn to others very clearly and effectively to get the support they need. So they tend to experience really high levels of stress. Supporting this kind of developmental pathway, we see that attachment stems from early parenting, specifically inconsistent, neglectful, or abusive care in infancy leads children to develop an insecure attachment orientation. And adult attachment orientations predict health. So the extent to which you still have those beliefs in adulthood has been shown to predict a number of health markers and behaviors. So to test this kind of mechanistic pathway, we once again return to the Minnesota longitudinal study of risk and adaptation. We focused in on that maternal sensitivity measure and looking at the sensitive, non-obtrusive care and support the children received from their mothers in early childhood, specifically focusing on those first 4 assessments. Attachment was then assessed using the adult attachment interview, which was given twice at age 19 and then at 26 years old. So the adult attachment interview asks people to reflect on their relationship with their parents and talk about, to what extent their parents were there for them, how they would describe their parents and give examples of specific experiences that illustrate those descriptors. And what we look for in this interview is themes of attachment security. So to what extent do individuals describe themselves as, being able to turn for parents for help in hard times? To what extent do the parents then provide that kind of help and support? And did that allow the child to then go out and explore the world? And then finally, at age 37, we looked at 4 objective markers of health risk factors. So C-reactive protein, which is a substance in blood that's been shown to be a inflammatory marker predictive of heart disease risk. We measured their height and weight to look at BMI. We also looked at where that weight was being carried. We see that people with more central adiposity, more weight around the stomach, and a higher waist to hip ratio tend to have particularly poor health outcomes. And we measured blood pressure to calculate mean arterial pressure, which is a metric used by combining systolic and diastolic blood pressure measurements. What we found was that maternal sensitivity and attachment both predicted cardiometabolic risk. So individuals with high levels of maternal sensitivity and more secure attachment had lower cardiometabolic risk at age 37. And so when we really fully tested this pathway, we found that maternal sensitivity predicted attachment security. So individuals who had more sensitive mothers early in life felt more secure in relationships at late adolescence and early adulthood, and then had lower cardiometabolic risk at age 37. So we do see this pathway that kind of our beliefs about relationships that allow us to successfully build more relationships in the future and use those relationships to deal with stress effectively, did predict objective health markers in adulthood. All right, so I'm going to be moving on soon to think about, how we can draw on this literature to improve our own relationships. But before I do that, I wanted to kind of open the floor if there's any questions about the studies I've just described or about how relationships impact health.
Hi, Allison. Thank you so much for sharing this so far. We don't have any live questions yet, but we have a couple that came in ahead of time that are related. Mm-hmm. One is, I think you just talked about this a lot, but does the research bear itself out among children as well as adults? Anything you want to add to the difference between adolescents or children and adults with this research?
Yeah, so we now have pretty good bodies of evidence that relationship quality matters for both children and adults. Obviously, some of the relationships in play are going to be different there. For instance, we see relationships with parents being more impactful on children than adults, while romantic partners become a bigger predictor of health outcomes. But we see it on both sides. And with some of the work I've been talking about today, we're starting to see some good evidence that relationships in childhood can have these lasting effects. So it's not just a matter of what your relationships are like in adulthood, but these early relationships can have effects as well.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Why don't we keep talking? There's a few more questions that we have, but they're kind of general, so we'll leave those to the end.
Perfect. All right. So the second half of my talk, I really want to focus on how you can use this in your lives. How can we use the power of high quality close relationships to improve our own health and well-being? So I'm going to highlight 5 things that we should be trying to do more often, and then 5 things to avoid. So starting with good things, what you should be doing. We should try to give and receive social support. So when either you or your close relationship partners, whether these are romantic partners or friends or family members, are feeling stressed out or in need, try to provide social support to them. Support can take multiple forms. So some people really appreciate and need emotional support. So trying to soothe their negative emotions, build up their sense of esteem, provide physical comfort. Getting that hug from somebody you care about can feel really good. But sometimes people really want more what we call instrumental support. So they want, advice or information to help them solve their problem. They might need you to do them a favor or loan them money in order to help them kind of work through the issue they're dealing with. So there's lots of ways to provide support. And so it's a matter of figuring out what you or your partner needs in the moment and then letting them know what you need or giving it to them when they need it. We see that social support buffers the negative effects of stress on health. And having having a supportive social network really improves immune functioning. One classic demonstration of this came from the common cold studies that Dr. Sheldon Cohen conducted at Carnegie Mellon University. What he did was have people fill out surveys about their lives and their social relationships, and then expose them to the common cold virus to see if they develop a cold and how severe their symptoms were. And what they found was that individuals who are experiencing a lot of stress in their life leading up to exposure to the cold were at higher risk of developing an infection, but only if they had low levels of social support. So if we look at those dotted lines, we see that higher levels of days with tension was associated with a higher probability of infection for individuals who were below average levels of social support. But for individuals who had, average or high levels of social support, there was no effect of stress on the probability of infection. They could get exposed to the cold virus, but they wouldn't actually get sick from it if they had supportive social networks. Tip number 2 is to not only be responsive when your partner is feeling bad about something and needs support, but also to celebrate the good with them. Relationship partners need you to be responsive when things are good too. Capitalization is the process of responding positively to another person's positive life events. So when your partner, comes home and says, "Oh, I got a promotion at work," or "I got, some other kind of good news," you shouldn't just be dismissive of that or, give a positive response, but be kind of lackluster. What's going to be most effective for your relationship and for your health is to really celebrate those good experiences because that's going to improve positive affect for both you and your partner. We see that when people share their good news and have a partner respond really positively and enthusiastically to that, that shows it leads to a positive boost in emotion for both partners over time. So not only do you get that kind of empathetic positive boost for you, but your partner is going to feel more positively about the thing that just happened to them for longer. And this is great for health because we see that increased levels of positive affect are associated with better health, especially for people under stress. So this was looked at in some of those common cold studies I just talked about. And we see people who experience less positive emotions in everyday life If they don't experience those positive emotions very often, they're more at risk for developing a cold after exposure. And we see this with other markers of health as well. So one series of studies brought people into the lab, put tape on their hand and ripped it off multiple times in a row. So, really damaging kind of that outer barrier of your skin, and then looked at how quickly the skin was able to recover. And so when they found that when they looked at people who were experiencing stress, those who managed to have higher positive affect despite that stress tended to recover much more quickly than those who experienced lower levels of positive affect. So by capitalizing with your partner and celebrating that good news, you're kind of giving them those positive boosts in emotion that might help protect them health when they're, faced with risks to their health, like exposure to viruses or high stress. Tip number 3 is to try to gain new experiences. As humans, we're motivated to expand our sense of self and add to it, bringing in new knowledge, identities, social roles, and other kinds of experiences. And one way we experience this self-growth is through a relationship. Early on, this often occurs when our partner introduces us to aspects of themselves, and we get to kind of take those on into our self-concept. So here are 2 pictures of me and my husband when we first started dating back in college. We came from very different backgrounds. He grew up in Manhattan, New York City, and I grew up in a small town in Central Florida. And so early on, there was a lot of self-expansion happening as I rode the subway for the first time and got to try all sorts of new restaurants and see Broadway shows and enjoy these activities that I had never tried before. While he got to come and visit me and see what small town life was like, which was a really good buildup for moving to Oxford. And get to explore the beach and the swamp and all those unique Florida experiences. But this can be harder to do as relationships go on. In those first few months or years of a relationship, as you're first getting to know each other and learning all these things about each other, this self-expansion just kind of happens naturally. But as you get to know each other better, you fall into routines, it can be hard to maintain that. But studies show that it's worth the effort to do. Engaging in exciting, novel activities together with your partner promotes self-growth and satisfaction in the relationship. So doing things like making an effort to travel, picking up new hobbies like biking together, or learning more about something you're interested in, like wine. All these things are going to provide opportunities to grow your sense of self. And when you do that with your relationship partner, it can have positive effects on your relationship as well. And studies have shown that experiencing more self-expansion through your relationship and seeing your relationship as providing a lot of potential for self-expansion is associated with better self-reported health and lower levels of depressive symptoms. Tip number 4 is to express gratitude. Gratitude can be defined as the positive emotion that arises when we recognize another person has done something beneficial for us. So we need to be kind of on the lookout to recognize when somebody does a kind act and take a moment to appreciate it in order to experience gratitude. This is something that, many of us kind of stumble upon, but we also kind of miss in our relationships. We might take things for granted or not notice, the good things that our partner does for us. Gratitude interventions that ask people to, journal each night about, what things their partner has done for them today and to, make an effort to express gratitude to the partner more frequently have been shown to improve overall relationship satisfaction and even sexual satisfaction for both partners. And increased gratitude is associated with a number of health benefits, such as better sleep, reduced blood pressure, reduced depressive symptoms, and slower biological aging. So taking a moment to recognize when your partner is doing some of these good things, like providing support and capitalizing with you, and feeling that appreciation and sharing that with them can have great benefits for your relationship and your health. And finally, my last positive tip is to take a third-party perspective. Conflict will and should occur in relationships. I'll talk more about this in the second part of this. But during those conflicts, or at least after those conflicts, because sometimes it's hard to do it in the moment, it can be helpful to try to take a third-party perspective on the conversation. If you were an outside observer, how would you, interpret what both people were saying and doing during the conflict? One study that had newlyweds do this followed them 12 months after they were married with no intervention. And what they found was that relationship quality tended to decline. We see this over and over again in studies of marital quality. But after 1 year, half of the sample was assigned to what the researchers called the marriage hack. Basically, it asked them to reflect on a recent conflict from this third-party perspective. What they found was that once people were taught to do that, they experienced almost no decline in marital quality in the year following that, while those who didn't receive this intervention continued to decline. So taking a third-party perspective, maybe recognizing when you were maybe in the wrong and what you could do to avoid that in the future, can really help maintain marital quality. And I'm working on a grant proposal now to try to replicate this marriage hack and see if we see health benefits for that as well. If people are able to maintain their relationship quality, do we see improved physical health and healthier stress responses as well? That might explain some of the broader effects of this intervention. All right, so that's 5 things to do, but there's also things that you shouldn't do. So let's talk about what you should avoid. You should not use what we call the 4 horsemen behavior. So these are 4 behaviors that are highly predictive of divorce over time. They were termed the 4 horsemen because they're kind of like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse from the Bible. When you engage in these behaviors, it spells the end of your relationship. And studies show that engaging in these behaviors increases your risk of divorce. So those 4 behaviors are criticism, so ad hominem attacks on the partner, especially those that say things like you always do this or you never do that. Defensiveness, so when your partner comes to you with a problem, really giving a lot of excuses or turning it back around on them. Stonewalling, which is when you withdraw from the interaction and just sort of shut down. And finally, and most importantly, contempt. This is the behavior that's been shown to predict the highest risk of divorce. So in conflict, showing disrespect, sarcasm, and scoffing is associated with particularly poor prognosis for your relationship. And unsurprisingly, we see these kinds of hostile behaviors also associated with health problems. One of the first studies to illustrate this brought couples into the lab and had them discuss one of the biggest ongoing conflicts in their relationship, and then formed blisters on their hands using a suction device, and then had the people come back to the lab multiple days over the following weeks to see how quickly those blisters healed. What they found was that individuals who were less hostile in those marital interactions tended to heal more quickly. Those blisters were more likely to be gone 10, 15 days after the interaction than those who had more hostility in those conflict interactions. So if you're able to avoid those hostile behaviors, those 4 horsemen, that's going to help your body heal more quickly. And studies since then have also shown that marital hostility is associated with increased risk for heart disease, markers like blood pressure and arterial stiffness. A second thing not to do is you shouldn't always avoid negativity. We just talked about how hostility can be really bad, but occasionally expressing anger and frustration can show investment in the relationship. Shows that you're motivated to try to change things. You're not just sort of giving up because you think it's pointless. Studies on behavior change show that when individuals have more negativity in a discussion, when trying to convince their partner to change their behavior, that doesn't feel good in the moment. Both partners feel worse about how that conversation went right after. But it predicts more change in that behavior over time. So if you're trying to convince a partner to, maybe develop some healthier habits, avoid doing some things that hurts their health, being a little negative and showing that this is something that really matters to you can result in more change over time. We see that forgiveness is good, but it can also lead to a partner engaging in more transgressions and leading to more conflict over time. So really being thoughtful about, when to be negative, what to be negative about can be important for actually producing change in your relationship. But it's always good to keep this in mind that you need to use it sparingly. So one set of studies by John Gottman, the researcher who identified the 4 horsemen behaviors, found that individuals need to experience 8 times as much positivity as negativity in their relationships in order to have good outcomes. So if you're going to be negative, use it when it is really important to you, and try to balance that with a lot of positivity as well and celebrate the good things about your relationship. Third thing not to do is don't be overbearing. Yes, you should provide support to your partner, but that support needs to be responsive to the partner's needs. Do they want support in that moment? Particularly if one partner is under a lot of chronic stress and you're providing support to them a lot, that imbalance in support can cause a lot of problems. And so they may want you to kind of step back and not be trying to help all the time. It also needs to be responsive in terms of what form of support the partner wants. So going back to those 2 forms that we talked about earlier, some people prefer emotional or instrumental support overall. Some people might want one form or the other more for a specific problem. And if you're not giving people the kind of support they want and need, they're not going to feel like it's that helpful and they're not going to benefit from it. We see that when support is not responsive, it's associated with worse health outcomes. So study that I was involved with looked at levels of self-disclosure, and so people talking about their problems, and then those people rated how responsive they felt like that person was in that interaction. If that person was responsive, they received benefits from that self-disclosure. They showed better levels of glucocorticoid receptor expression, so better signs of stress response in the body, and greater positive affect. But if that partner wasn't responsive, they actually showed worse outcomes. A similar study looked at the interaction between receiving social support and responsiveness, and found that receiving high levels of social support that wasn't very responsive actually put people at risk for mortality over time. So if your support you're providing is not what your partner is looking for, they're not going to benefit from it, and it may actually hurt their health and your relationship. Thing number 4, don't always assume the worst from your partner. So when we look at our partner's behavior, we're going to make attributions about that. We're going to try to explain why it's happening. And that can be due to 3 different kinds of factors. We may make judgments about whether it's an internal versus external factor. Is this something about their personality, or is it something about the situation they're placed in that lead them to act in a certain way? Is it a stable or unstable factor? Is this, something that's always true of them and you can't change it, or is it something that sort of fluctuates? And to what extent is this factor something that governs a wide variety of their behavior, something more global, or is it something more specific and unique to this issue? And so it can be important to look at what kinds of attributions are you making for your partner's positive and negative behavior. We see that couples with low relationship quality tend to show this kind of relationship distressing attributional pattern. So when their partner does something negative, they assume it's due to internal, stable, and global factors. If your husband forgets the dry cleaning, it's because he doesn't care. This is something that he always does. He never remembers to get it. And he just doesn't do his share in the relationship broadly. When he does something positive, you're making maybe more external, unstable, and specific attributions for that behavior, saying, it was his mother that told him to buy him. It wasn't something he came up with himself. This is, not consistent. It's not something he will continue to do to have these romantic moments. And I bet he wants something. This is, a unique situation that's leading this behavior. And making attributions in these ways really further undermines relationship quality and makes you feel more stressed and puts you at higher risk for poor health outcomes. Instead, we should try to flip those around. When something negative happens, we should make those kinds of external, unstable, and specific attributions. Your husband forgets the dry cleaning, it's because he's worried about work. Think about all the things that he does usually remember and how he helps out in other ways. If something positive happens, that's when you can make those internal, stable, and global attributions. Really recognizing that, he always does kind things like this. And it's like all the other romantic efforts you've made. So try to make sure that as you make these attributions, you're recognizing external things that might be having negative effects and recognizing the good things that are more stable and global and internal. And finally, don't be afraid to seek help. Marital and couples therapy is very effective. 70 to 80% of couples show improvement in relationship functioning following therapy. And most of these gains tend to be fairly well maintained over time. We see that couples therapy improves mental health. There have been fewer studies looking at couples therapy and physical health, but given the kinds of effects of low levels in support and hostility and some of the things that couples therapy is designed to address, we would expect to see physical health outcomes as well. We see that a wide variety of forms of marital therapy are effective. So 3 of the therapy styles that have shown the most empirical support for improving outcomes are cognitive behavioral therapy, emotion-focused therapy, and integrative behavioral therapy. So if you're seeking those out, those might be some buzzwords to look at. But it's important not to wait until things are dire. When marital therapists are interviewed about, what leads couples to be successful following therapy or not, one of the most common things they say is that there are some couples that they may have been able to help, but they just came in too late, where problems had really built up too much. These negative attributional styles had gotten too deeply ingrained, and it was harder for them to help. There's been a growing push in the marital therapy world to start doing marital therapy early on in relationships before problems even form. So having couples go through marital therapy is a form of premarital counseling. But even if you feel like there's some problems arising in your relationship, it might be helpful to go to couples therapy earlier rather than later. Address those problems head on, fix them before they become big problems and before they have bigger negative impacts on your relationship and your health. All right. That is everything I have prepared today, but I'm very excited to hear all of your questions. I also have a lot of people to thank for their assistance and their guidance in this work. So my advisors from graduate and my postdoctoral training, my major collaborators, both outside of Miami and at Miami, and particularly my lab. I am up to 10 undergraduates and 4 graduate students working in my lab, pushing this research forward. And I could not do this work without them. And so it's so exciting to see them, learn more about this, inspire new directions for my research, and get that experience. And finally, I want to thank the National Institutes of Health in Miami for funding the research that I've presented today. I'm excited to hear all of your questions. Thank you for being here again.
Awesome, Allison. Thank you so much, and congratulations on all the research. Yeah, we have a good deal of questions coming in. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little feedback, but hopefully the audio is okay. Mm-hmm. All right, so this is a good segue from the one we just had. Was someone asked ahead of time suggestions for encouraging loved ones to consider therapy. There's lots of resistance due to stigma around therapy and counseling. Any suggestions for how to deal with that?
I think one thing is to just talk about it being more of a preventative measure. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that says your relationship's in trouble. And it's going to probably be more effective and help if you go before you have major issues. Just as, if you can do things to improve your health before you develop issues like, diabetes or cancer, you want to take advantage of that. And marital therapy can be the same way by, getting that preventative care to help prevent your relationship from getting sick and from getting you sick. Reframing it as not something that means there's a problem, but means something that you're invested in the health of your relationship might be a good way to frame that.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have a question that seems like adolescence is an important development time for future health. How can we support our adolescents to bolster their health later?
Yes. So there's really a big body of literature showing that adolescents, with addition to all the biological changes that are happening, there's also key psychological changes. And it seems at a time as, kids become more independent, a time when a lot of really lasting changes can take effect. So supporting, your adolescence is going to be critically important for their long-term health and well-being. Um, Adolescence is a time that, kids are moving from really relying on their parents for social support to more of their peers and their romantic partners, which I think can be a little tough for parents to let go sometimes. But if you can, foster your kids with those kind of good social skills that they need, help them build strong friendships so that they can start relying on their peers for support, that's going to help them transition to adulthood more successfully. We see that in adolescence. If we stress kids out in the lab, with younger kids, having their parents there helps. Those parents are a good buffer, a good form of social support for them. But in adolescence, that doesn't work anymore. And so we need to help them kind of transition those social needs to their friends and build the kind of friendships that can provide the support and the capitalization that they need.
Perfect. Another question that came in says, lots of research about the influence from mothers. Any research about fathers' influence on relationships? I assume similar, but is there a difference there?
Yeah, this is such an important question, and something that the developmental psych field has really had to grapple with. Early on, it was all focused on mothers. The Minnesota longitudinal study, because it started in the 70s, kind of has that early influence, and especially with these mothers living below the poverty line, many of them were single mothers, so there wasn't as much paternal involvement in the sample as maybe a higher socioeconomic status sample might have. But there is a growing literature on paternal care. We do see that paternal care is really important and promotes good health outcomes in children. There's some interesting studies that suggest that, some things that dads do might have different effects than moms. So, for example, kind of overstimulating play has been associated with kind of worse emotional outcomes for kids when moms do it. But when dads are overstimulating, it doesn't seem to have those negative effects. And it seems like that form of play and interaction is maybe more normative and more helpful when coming from dads. But a lot of the paternal care work is in early stages. We haven't seen as big samples, as replicated samples. And I know that's something that's a big priority for a lot of people, and understanding differences between maternal and paternal care and the interaction between the two. For instance, if you have a mom who maybe isn't as warm and responsive and supportive, but your dad is, will that make up for it to, lead to long-term health outcomes? We don't fully know yet, but we're working on it.
All right. Thank you. A couple more. And Allison, I don't know if these are right in line with your research, but they're relationship questions. So we're gonna give them a go.
Let's try it.
How important is it to reconnect with people? Does this extend to toxic individuals?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, we definitely see that having a broad social network is important. When people, prune their networks too much and are just relying on, one or two people for all their social needs, that can cause a lot of problems. And you're probably not going to get as effective, care and support than if you had a broader network that maybe, certain people you could go to for certain issues or for certain needs in your, social life. So overly pruning can be bad. But if you have these relationships that are, consistently stressing you out, that, you've tried to improve, but they remain, hostile or dismissive or withdrawing, it may, if we think about your health, that the stress increases that you're experiencing from trying to maintain those relationships may not be worth any benefits you get from them. So, it can be hard to figure out where that line is. Definitely encourage people to, seek help from therapists to kind of talk through their specific issues, to kind of figure out, what's going to be best for them. But, if you're experiencing a really high level of stress from that relationship, and it's not showing signs of being able to improve, that might not be worthwhile.
Makes sense. Okay, and then finally, do you have any suggestions on the best way to make new friends when moving to a new part of the country?
Yeah, this is, really tricky, particularly as adults. I think a lot of us have experienced, if we, leave our hometowns or even where we went to college, trying to build those new social networks. We see that, Part of it is just putting that effort forward. People are more likely to like people who like them. So if you express interest in someone, if you say, hey, let's go out, let's get coffee, I'd like to get to know you better, people are probably going to respond pretty positively to that. I think that's something that, makes us feel a lot of anxiety, but it can, really help start the basis of an ongoing friendship. Another thing is just having repeated interactions over time. We see that individuals who are going to, run into more often, it's easier to build those relationships naturally. And that can be easier to do in, college when you're living in dorms together, going to class together. But thinking of ways to do that in adulthood as well. So, going to, classes or meetup groups that meet regularly, giving you those opportunities to run into the same people again and again, can be really good strategies for building friendships in adulthood.
All right, good. And then I was just curious, how often in your relationship do you pull the "I'm a relationship expert" card out? Is that a common one?
I try to limit it. Yeah, no, but I think one of the things I've found is that I'm usually not thinking about relationship science in the moment. Like if my husband and I are, in the middle of an argument, I'm not coding each of our behavior for the four horsemen. But it can be helpful afterwards to kind of reflect and be like, oh, that was a little bit defensive. I should be on the lookout for that in the future. So it's, in the calmer moments, you can kind of reflect back on it. But yeah, I don't play that card in the heat of the moment. I don't think that's going to be good for anyone.
Well, you're better than me because I certainly would. One other more of a comment I'll read from Michelle. She says, "This is amazing information. I teach early childhood and I share with my students the impact of trauma on children. This is further information about how relationships in childhood impact adulthood. Thank you so much."
Yeah.
And I guess we will leave it at that. I also need to apologize. I forgot that a thinly striped shirt makes people's eyes go crazy on the screen, so that's my bad. But most importantly, thank you, Allison, so much for your time. This was great research that you presented. We really appreciate you sharing it with us. I want to make sure everyone knows that we have a bunch of different webinar topics on our webinar site, which you're on now probably, but it's alumlc.org/Miami, Ohio. Bunch of cool things coming up, so keep an eye on that or our emails. And other than that, any parting words from you, Allison?
No, just thank you all for being here today, and definitely look out for more from our lab in Miami at the future.
All right, thank you so much, and love and honor.